Welcome to Babblecom 5. As it turns out, I need to add a prologue to my prologue for this video because I've just discovered something that I wasn't aware of, and that is that I had thought this was the original version of The Gathering, which was the pilot episode of Babylon 5, and I've now discovered there are actually two versions of The Gathering. And I realised whilst I was watching it that there were parts of this which didn't seem to gel with the version that I remembered. And it turns out that the reason for this is that this is actually a TNT version of The Gathering, which was released in 1998. So the DVD, which I thought was actually quite an old DVD, is not as old as I thought it was. It was actually released in 2002, even though The Gathering itself dates from 1993. But this version of it, which isn't mentioned on the front of the cover of the DVD at all, is actually from 1998. And so what they did was they edited it slightly, they changed the music, and they actually upgraded, in effect, the special effects in some places. So you'll hear me comment at points during the watch through that I think the graphics are better than I would have expected, and it turns out there's probably a very good reason for that, because they were probably the redone graphics. And apparently the backstory to this version is that when TNT started running the series, they wanted to sort of introduce people to it, and they decided that they would re-release The Gathering in a slightly modified form as a sort of introduction to the series as it then was. And so I think there are various elements here that have been shortened or added in, which I recall from my original watching of The Gathering as it was originally, and which I thought it was odd because I could have sworn there was some that for example, one small example of this is that when Jakar is speaking to Lita, in the version in my head, he invokes a thing called privacy, where these sort of bars of light kind of group around the two of them, so that in theory then people can't overhear what they're talking about. And that's completely missing from this version. So it wasn't my imagination, there is actually a difference here. So I apologise in advance if any of this seems slightly misleading off the back of this, but I've literally only found it out after putting the video together and noticing that right at the very start it says TNT Presents, and as soon as I saw that, I must have missed that when I was sort of first setting up, because that immediately clued me into the fact that it must have been some form of adaptation of it. So of course, one quick Google search later and I discover that there are in fact two versions of The Gathering out there. And it is quite interesting because this does add stuff in which is interesting in the sense that it wasn't in there originally. So the whole dust content, that wasn't in the original. I didn't think it was. I didn't remember dust being mentioned so early on, but that obviously got added in after the fact, but must presumably have been part of the original footage that was shot. It just wasn't dropped in the original version of The Gathering. So even more to The Gathering than I had ever realised, despite thinking that I knew most stuff about the series. Perhaps I did know it once and I've just forgotten since, I don't know. But of course, not being in the States, I dare say that the TNT version never got shown in the UK. So that would explain why I've probably never heard of it. So with that, I will now get out of my own way and let you get on with watching the rest of the video. Having stressed that this is the TNT version of The Gathering, which it turns out that I was watching, despite my believing something else entirely. Hopefully it won't make a much difference in terms of the comments and so on, but it does explain a lot. And also apparently the audio from the Battle of the Line, which you hear during Jeff discussing it later, was added in after the fact as well, so that wasn't in there originally. But interestingly, even though they could have done, they didn't drop in any graphics from that, so that was quite an interesting choice. So there's probably a discussion to be had about the differences between the two, but I've no idea how you'd find a an original version of The Gathering, because I thought this was quite an old DVD and therefore it was the original version, but clearly not. I'm sure it got released on video at the time, but I don't know whether or not it's actually out on DVD unless it's in one of the compilation sets that I don't have. It's possible. So anyway, yes, I'll now get out of my own way. Thank you. I'll point out right at the beginning that this is a bit of an experiment for me. I normally heavily script these videos before I embark on them, so that I'm reading from a script for the entire video, basically. But I thought I'd try and do something a little bit more off the cuff for this video about The Gathering. And The Gathering was the feature-length pilot episode for Babylon 5, and it was a funny one in the sense that it was filmed a little time before the series proper really got into gear, and as a result you find that quite a few of the main cast members got recast, or were in fact, they were completely different characters in fact by the time it came to the first episode of the first season. So for that reason, I've held off doing anything on The Gathering up until the point where I'd finished the first season, because otherwise it's actually a little bit confusing in a sense, because you even get people turning up in the series who played different characters in The Gathering, and so if you're unfamiliar with the series, you're just kind of left scratching your head saying, well, what happened? And indeed, where did these people go? Some people come back, some people do not. I'll try and keep it as spoiler free as I possibly can, but I'm going to assume that you've at least sort of seen season 1, I think, at this point, because that's the order in which I'm approaching this. So if you're following this channel, you've probably already gone through my season 1 videos, I'm hoping. So this shouldn't come as a massive shock to the system and shouldn't break anything massively for you. But as with anything else, I like to be upfront about the potential for spoilers, and so I have been. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start playing it. I'm going to record my thoughts every now and again as I'm going through, which is not what I normally do. I normally record it, I normally type it as I go, and then redo it back, and then give you my reactions to it. But I'm going to try and do it more at the same time this time, and I'll add some screenshots in at a later date. I'm just going to sort of sit and watch it and comment from time to time, and hopefully that'll end up with a video that's a reasonable length for you to listen to at the end. So I'm just looking at the actual DVD box itself, which is making me smile, because I've had this for donkey's years, and it's not even a fully plastic DVD case. It's one of those sort of, I think you'd call it a clamshell case. It's got a slight sort of wraparound on the front of it. So you kind of click it open on the front and then fold it out. So it's properly old school. It's not from the big box compilation of the series that you can get. This is a proper old school Gathering DVD. So I'm gonna hit play and get on with it. So the look and feel of the sort of the customs entrance is quite different to the series version. The lighting's different. It's all a little bit more sort of slightly Blade Runner-esque almost. Interestingly, they've just done a narcotics scan, and Garibaldi's identified the substance as dust, which is interesting because that is something that crops up much later in the series. So it's really interesting to hear it mentioned now, just in that sort of throwaway sense. Garibaldi is very much Garibaldi, but his staff are immediately somewhat different to what you see on the series. It's really interesting seeing this, not having seen it for years and years, because it's creating quite a different sort of vibe to season 1 already. So I'll keep going. The PPG designs are very different. I remember the guns looking different in the pilot episode, and they are. Sinclair's been typically hands-on and sort of putting himself right into the line of fire here, as he normally does. It's quite funny listening to Takashima go head-to-head with Jakar, because she's quite Ivanova-esque in terms of her stylings, shall we say, offering to send his ship a food basket while she keeps them waiting in space because they refuse to submit to a scan. That's quite entertaining. Nice succinct little explanation of what happens to Babylons 1 to 3 and Babylon 4 from Sinclair in response to a question from Lita Alexander. That's useful to understand. I'm not sure that ever really gets covered in season 1. It does ultimately, of course, because we find out over the course of a couple of episodes what happened to them, but I didn't realise it was covered in the pilot quite so explicitly. Makes sense though. There's a lot of explanation going on, including a conversation I'm listening to now about what Kosh is or might look like, and that it's the first sight of the Doctor as well here, Dr. Kyle. A lot of the props are quite different. The links are different. They're more like a wristwatch. The breathers in the alien sector are different as well, and as I said, the guns are different as well. So it's a lot of little details have changed, and there's an alien race on the elevator I don't recognise at all. Nice interior garden shot. Yes, okay, we get it. It's fresh air, Jeff. We understand. Now, see, Delenn is quite different as well. They changed the makeup for her quite a lot. She looks more like a male here than she does in the first season. Her tone is very much Delenn tone, though. It's really interesting. Even her bone structure and her bone colour is different on her head. It's quite strange. I remember it looking very different, and it does look a lot different. It's quite interesting because she's also been quite forthcoming with Sinclair with information about the Vorlons, although of course it's probably edited down rather than being the full amount. But yeah, she does look really different. It's quite strange. I mean, it may well be because there was such a gap between the pilot and the first season. Obviously, they had a chance to revise a lot of things, so maybe they just weren't happy with it off the back of the pilot, and they had the chance to change it, so they did. Would make sense. There's Mr. Morden. I said currently he's a tech on Babylon 5. That's one of the most obvious changes. And here's Kosh's ship, and he's early. 2 days early, in fact. And Takashima is not happy. So we get a typical Londo in the casino scene with Garibaldi trying to be persuaded to part with some credits. And Mr. Delvana, who we've seen quite a lot of so far in the background, introduces himself to Londo, presumably with a view to sponsoring his new betting scheme, which apparently is worked out to 15 decimal places. And then we move on to Lita overseeing a commercial transaction, looking very shifty in doing so. Yeah, she's calling his bluff. Nice. Quite an interesting scene, just also comedic, of course, but it's Jakar basically propositioning Lita Alexander for her genetic structure, which might involve a direct mating with Jakar, assuming that her pleasure thresholds are adequate to the task. We don't actually see her respond to that proposition, but it does make clear that her family is very telepathically active back to when records began, but also that the Narn are very interested in getting hold of telepaths because they don't have their own. So we've seen Kosh's ship arrive, rather beautiful, and here's Kosh himself. And tellingly, Sinclair is stuck in a lift. And the next we see of him is Kosh horizontal, and Sinclair not having even gone into the same corridor as Kosh. So they take him into an ISO lab with the right atmospheric mix, so far as they've been told. This is quite interesting because the Vorlons have basically said don't crack his encounter suit open, And Sinclair has said that because he's a doctor, he can do it and they'll not record anything else. And so this is the intervention that I think it was in Believers was referenced, that Sinclair makes his own bloody rules up when it suits him, because here he is intervening in a health issue because fundamentally he thinks that the future of the station is at stake. I'm not really sure it's very professional to be shacking up with Caroline in the midst of a diplomatic crisis with a terminal Vorlon on board, but anyway, at least he's getting up to answer the doctor's call, I suppose. So we don't actually see inside the encounter suit, but it's obviously he's been able to get access and been able to treat him some way, shape or form. And it seems to be poison. So there's always been this question mark about how poison managed to get into Kosh's system, given that he's normally inside an encounter suit. So it's very odd. And with that, Sinclair locks down the station. It's a very interesting exchange here, because G'Kar is trying to get Delenn on side, and when she refuses, he then has a go at her and describes the Minbari war with Earth for the first time. And after that, so in the course of that sort of accusation that they surrendered because of the religious caste and the Grey Council, Delenn has fetched a sort of a power ring, for want of a better description, from this concealed cupboard, and proceeds to use it to crush the life out of G'Kar, and warns him not to mention the Grey Council again in her presence. So it's quite an interesting way to sort of introduce the two of them, and it also describes the backstory between the Narn and the Centauri as well, because what G'Kar is saying is that they are the youngest of the Federations who are, playing a major part in the station. So they've got unlimited manpower, whereas the Centauri are the oldest and they've got the technology. And so he's hoping that between them they could take on the Centauri, because Londo is the only one who is missing completely from anything to do with the greeting of the Vorlon ambassador Kosh. And so he's making this jump based on his own experience of the Centauri, that they've tried to poison Kosh in order to make an alliance with Earth, which of course is the last thing that G'Kar wants. So it's a very, very interesting exchange between the two, but this use of violence by Delenn is quite out of character with how she is in the first season, and I think they wound her back a little bit from this, although we do see her being very strong in other ways, of course, in season 1. So it's absolutely bob on in the sense that you shouldn't really sort of mess with her in that sense, because if you do so at your own peril, as G'Kar is now finding out. The background aliens are really different to what they were, what they're like in the first season. There are some really wacky designs that you never ever see again in the series itself. You can tell they were trying very hard for the pilot, bless them. There's a very telling exchange here between Garibaldi and Londo about just how far the Centauri Republic has fallen in his perception. They seem to be down to 12 worlds when they once possessed apparently the entire quadrant in which the station is based. And he's saying that basically they seem to have turned into nothing more than a tourist attraction for other races, and they're actually trying to attach themselves to the Earth Alliance because they see the Earth Alliance as being in the ascendant at the moment. So that's very much in keeping with season 1, where we see Londo starting out as feeling that the Centauri have completely lost their way and are, just under the heel of every other race going, including the Narn, really, at that point. So this is interesting because it's very much setting the tone for season 1. And of the characters, arguably Londo and Garibaldi are amongst those who are the closest to what they're going to be in season 1 as well. So, this does make a certain amount of sense, really, as you'd expect. It's quite interesting because the Doctor mentions that he's been using stims to stay with it. And Takashima's also partial to coffee like Ivanova. and she's also set up an illicit coffee plantation in the hydroponics section as well, which is naughty. So the doctor's actually come to Takashima to get her assistance with getting Kosh scanned by the telepath, because of course Kosh is the only one who actually knows what happened, from his perspective at least. But now, of course, they've got to persuade Lita to do the scan on a Vorlon. So Takashima's not against guilt-tripping Lita into scanning the Vorlon to try and save everyone on the station, basically. The doctor doesn't think he's going to remember it, so they're doing their level best to get her to do it, but trying to con her into the bargain. It's a bit silly, given that she's a telepath, she'll know when they're lying. So we see that whatever breached the hull earlier in the episode that came from the non-transport ship has caused a hull breach, which the CNC crew have now detected, and they're going to investigate. So that might answer some questions, because Garibaldi's only lead at the moment is the fact that Sinclair's report of the lift doesn't accord with the fact that the system doesn't register a problem with the lift at that point in time. So it's rather interesting. So Lita's literally taking the gloves off in order to try and make contact with Kosh, because she can't break through his suit. His suit's shielded against scans, which is quite telling. Yeah, it's very interesting. That's not a detail I picked up on, although I've heard people mention it, is that Kosh, when he sees Sinclair in his vision, when he's greeting him, he greets him as Entil Tsar Valen, which is very, very interesting for lots of reasons, which I won't go into here, but it's, given the timing of this is a classic example of JMS's advanced planning basically going on. I can't remember if someone said that was actually sort of dubbed in after the fact, or if it was always in the cut, but this is such an old DVD, I can't believe that was added just for the DVD. I might have to investigate that, or if anyone knows, do let me know in the comments. Thanks. Okay, moving on. And in a classic piece of time, of course, it's Sinclair immediately enters the med lab just as Lita's about to make her pronouncement. So this basically forces Sinclair to step down and Takashima to step up and chair the advisory council. So now we get the first inkling that something is up with Mr. Delvano, because he steps into a lift with someone who seems to recognise him, and then there's a flash, and then the guy steps out of the lift, the guy who's recognised him, but Delvano, it seems, doesn't step out of the lift. So here we get a hint of what's really going on here, and that it might well be the case, and in fact it wasn't Sinclair who poisoned Kosh, although that was what it appeared to be the case. So yeah, it's gradually building to a head now, and we've also just seen the sort of the boarding drone, if you like, take out a maintenance bot, which is obviously inevitably going to draw attention to itself. The advisory council chamber is similar to what it appears to be in season 1 as well. It's quite interesting because Jakar is the one who's actually leading the examination of the Doctor in the council chamber, and he's being very aggressive about it. And he asks him if he's identified the poison, and the poison that's been identified only comes from one sector that the Doctor is aware of, and that's where Sinclair's partner has just come back from. And of course she docked at the station about the same time as Kosh does. So Jakar's putting 2 and 2 together, and it's a very nice little frame-up job. So yeah, very, very interesting. And very interesting as well that Jakar offers Londo the chance to ask any questions that he might like, and Londo completely defers and looks pretty much completely disengaged with the process. So it's yeah, it's setting up the dynamics quite interestingly here. So Garibaldi doesn't like telepaths, it's established here, and he knows that Lita's had dealings with Varna, so he's also looked into Varna off the back of his suspicions. and it's apparent that Varna is a criminal, basically, and it's odd that he would risk coming to the station because his crimes are with the Earth Alliance, so they'd have jurisdiction to go after him. And yet he was allowed onto the station, of course, but he's also known as being a tech runner. And yet he burned Londo at the casino, having offered to back him and then backed out. And that's odd because his clientele often is the Centauri, so something is not adding up here. Interesting use of camera drones in the council chambers. That's quite ahead of its time when you stop and think about it. So Jakar's now saying that they should basically deport Sinclair to the Vorlon homeworld, and for some reason Londo's gone along with this, and of course the Vorlons have voted in Kosh's absence and Jakar's cast their vote for them, so they've got enough votes to do it. It's interesting because that is not really clear why Jakar would want this to happen as a concept, but we'll see. So Gabor has just found Delvana's body in his quarters, which means that whoever's been running around isn't Delvana. It's a very interesting interaction between Sinclair's partner Caroline and Delenn. I don't remember that at all, but it's odd because it sounds like there's some sort of history that's gone on before between Delenn and Sinclair, which makes Caroline think that Delenn owes Sinclair a favour in some way, shape or form. But I've no idea what that stems from, so that's a very curious one. And it's also interesting because Delenn says that she's only there to observe him rather than presumably do anything else. But as Caroline says, it's like, well, what the hell does that mean exactly? Why would she be observing him? And obviously, if you've seen season 1, then you know why that makes more sense. But here, it just sounds really odd. So it's an interesting bit of foreshadowing that. But I also don't understand what would have come before that to make her sort of go directly to Delenn as an ambassador, sort of, and feel that she could face off with her like that. So, yeah, it's really interesting, that. And now we see a meeting between Lita and Jakar, apparently. And it's also interesting because we see that Jakar's got a gill implant so he can breathe in the alien sector without needing a breather unit. So that's quite interesting little detail. It's quite interesting. So it turns out that Londo was actually blackmailed into voting for Sinclair shipping out by Jakar, because Jakar had background information on some atrocities that his grandfather carried out. It's an interesting one because from a Centauri point of view, atrocities carried out in the Narn homeworld, I wouldn't have thought anyone would really give a damn about from a Centauri point of view, but it's interesting. First look at Jeff's Battle of the Line medal, which nearly thumps Caroline on the head. It seems to be pronounced Carolyn, actually, not Caroline. That's an English thing, I don't know. See, that's really odd as well. She didn't know that he was on the line. That's really odd, isn't it? Actually, she's quite shocked as well, which actually starts to make more sense. So this is a link in to give us some backstory. Every star an exploding ship. It's very interesting because we hear the background voices of the fight, but we don't see any of the effects shots that we see later in the series. It's an interesting way to deal with it. So it's established here that he's missing 24 hours. And he knows that they've stopped themselves, that the line didn't dissuade them. They stopped themselves. So this sets up his storyline in terms of him trying to find out why they stopped themselves, of course. So Cullen's telling him to do what he thinks is right rather than leaving and going along with the party line out of guilt on the basis that he lost his team at the line and he doesn't want it to happen again. She's a really good actress, actually. I really like her, but I don't think we ever see her again. I'll have to look into that. I don't know what else she's been in, but she's very good. Lita's come to pay a house visit to Kosh, but unfortunately, it ain't Lita. and she's busy turning off his life support systems as the Doctor tries to chat to her about it, and about the fact that Delvana was already dead when she says that she saw him in the casino and elsewhere. So it's apparent that this is not Lita. The Doctor's quite offensive and manages to wound her, and now we see Lita with Lita. Sinclair nearly takes a shot to the face. It's all very interesting. So now we know that this, basically, whoever this is running around copying the visuals of other people rather effectively. So apparently Kosh is responding to the counter agent quite well, and that Lita was trying to cancel out that progress by turning his various life support systems off. And now we see a bizarre sort of morphing face special effect from this false Lita. So Takashima's figured out that the tech runner had picked up a changeling net, so he's using holography basically to make himself look like multiple other people, which means that the Sinclair who poisoned Kosh wasn't Sinclair at all. It was somebody posing as Sinclair. And so now the hunt is on for the user of this net, which could well be doing him some serious damage because he's using it constantly. Takashima's managed to reconfigure the external sensors to lock on to the power source that the changeling net is putting out. And Garibaldi and Sinclair are going in after him, or her. And then the Volons arrive in full force, which is quite impressive. And now I've got Garibaldi and Sinclair using these great big huge walk-off rifle-y, automatic-y weapon-y things that we never ever see again, as far as I can recall. And Garibaldi and Jeff are not doing well here. They've been pushed into the alien sector and without any masks, which is not healthy for them. And all of a sudden Delen's here to help. Where's she come from? And how come she's suddenly strong enough to deadlift Garibaldi? Huh? Okay, that was a little bit weird. Interesting that Takashima's talking about screens to maximum. I wonder what that's supposed to mean, because they don't have shields. And quite frankly, opening up the defence grid on a Volon attack fleet is going to do absolutely naff all. And now we're down to just Sinclair hunting this individual. It sounds like they're firing ping pong balls at each other. It's quite funny. And it turns out the user of the changeling net is a Minbari, and somebody should have a word with health and safety about electrical fences being live on the station. Not good. Handy though. Volons are powering up, which is not a good thing. And the Minbari is looking pretty toasty. Sinclair asks him why. Why has he done it? And the Minbari responds that there is a hole in his mind. And then he arms himself to self-destruct, which means that Sinclair needs to leg it fast. This is actually a really interesting scene because it does remind us that fundamentally the station is a great big target, and it's very, very delicate. It's quite funny seeing the Volon ships turning around and legging it away as the station starts moving towards them. So that we now have a big battle to try and use thrusters to stabilise the station, stop its movement and get it spinning back on its axis again. So they just about managed to pull off. Yeah. I think that's about the first and only time we ever see that happen in the entire series. This use of thrusters to actually adjust the station's position. So it's quite interesting. It's a nice little point of tension. I was thinking that actually the quality of the rendering is arguably higher now than it is in season 1, but that might well be a time thing. I suspect they probably had enough time to actually do a few more rendering passes for this pilot than they would have on the weekly basis for the episodes. So it's interesting. It definitely looks better than I was expecting it to look. So yeah, it's really well done. That's really interesting. Caroline's ship is exactly the same as Catherine's ship. So they must have either they have the same profession or no one bothered changing the rendering at all. Somewhat ironically, the Doctor gives a very Vorlon-like answer when asked what he saw when he saw a Vorlon. But it's classic JMS writing, though. That's very much a deep JMS quote, let's put it that way. It's interesting that Delenn passes some information to Sinclair. So Sinclair gives Jakar his comeuppance, having realised that the assassin came on board the station, as you know, I'm sure you've already figured out, on board the little breaching pod that was on board the Narn transport ship, the supply ship that Jakar was so adamant couldn't be searched, and then suddenly changed his mind about and decided that it could be searched once, of course, it had deposited the Minbari assassin on board. So apparently Delvana was running late, and in an ideal world, as we saw on the computer screens actually as well, the changing net would have configured the Minbari to look like a Narn crew member so that he could get on board without drawing attention. Because Delvana missed the rendezvous, they had to get the Minbari assassin on using the breaching pod, and he then went to Delvana, off to Delvana, and adopted his identity as his first point of change, and then went on to set everything up as he needed it to happen in order to try and frame Sinclair and obviously, you know, potentially get the station destroyed. What's not really made massively clear here is exactly why this Minbari would have wanted that to happen. All we're really told is that he's some sort of kind of rogue warrior caste type member. But we do get this nice scene where Sinclair suggests to Jakar that he's put some sort of nanotech implant into him, which will allow members of Sinclair's warrior caste to track Jakar should anything happen to the station, and then inflict some nasty outcome on him, shall we say. But as we then find out, once Jakar's left, and once Garibaldi's implied that he knows about the tracker as well, Sinclair then tells us that in fact there isn't a tracker, but it's going to be interesting to see what tests they run trying to find it, because he knew that if there was a tracker they would eventually find it and get rid of it. So he decided to bluff in order to cause Jakar some grief, and always leave that little niggle in his mind should he try and pull off something else that could endanger the station. So it's an interesting bit of comeuppance, but it does leave quite a few questions unanswered as to why this particular Minbari would have wanted to do this, given that the station is part run by Minbari and has a lot of Minbari on board it as well, and Minbari aren't supposed to kill Minbari. So it's all very interesting. Obviously, a lot of that we don't know at this point. We wouldn't know that would be a strange thing for a Minbari to be trying to do. And the only clue we're given is his comment about there being a hole in Sinclair's mind, which again you could sort of piece together conceptually, because we know that Sinclair's got 24 hours missing, and that's actually clearly stated in the Gathering here. But obviously what we don't know is whether or not that's what this Minbari was referring to just before he kamikazes himself. So yeah, it's interesting how it all pulls together, and I'm just going to watch the last little bit, and then I'll come back with some more reaction. So that was that, and it's interesting. Just in the last couple of minutes, there is a scene between Sinclair and Delenn where Sinclair does note that he's got this 24-hour missing period from the Battle of the Line, and he mentions that what the Minbari warriors said to him, and Delenn dismisses it as a sort of a random insult that Minbari sometimes use. So, you know, and he actually questions her, and he does say, you know, you're holding something from me, are you holding out on me? And obviously she denies that and says that she would never withhold anything that was in his best interest for him to know. And I suppose the implication is this isn't in his best interest to know, because it would raise a hell of a lot of questions about what had gone on during the Battle of the Line period. So it's funny, it feels clunky in places. I think if you were coming to it cold, then it would seem clunky, whereas I'm watching it with a view to sort of linking it up to what comes afterwards. And in that sense, because it was all pre-written, or at least pre-scoped, it does work pretty well. There is still this question of how exactly Kosh would have interacted in such a way that his physical form would have got touched, given that his encounter suit doesn't normally get opened. So that's quite interesting. I'm not quite sure how that, if that ever really gets resolved conceptually. But as a whole, it hung together, I think, better than I remembered it doing. But it is kind of odd because obviously, things like the PPGs, which stay the same throughout the entire season, well, throughout the entire series, are different here in The Gathering, because obviously, presumably the original props were lost or destroyed or whatever, and they had to come up with new ones. So in that sense, it's a little bit curious because there are some disjoints. But then equally, this is a year before, so you could argue there was just a technological change, and they came up with different technology that then came into sort of common use by Earthfall. So in that sense, you can kind of join it all together. And at the end of the day, it's a pilot episode. They have to kind of make things bigger and bolder, and because they're trying to sell the series ultimately. I mean, it's dated 1993, so it was a good solid year before the series actually kind of properly restarted again. And obviously, only some people came back at that point, and other people were recast and so on. So I enjoyed it more than I thought I was going to, actually, because I think the effects were better than I remembered them being at the time. But of course, at the time, I was probably just watching them on a sort of a normal analog TV. So seeing it digitally, I think they'd probably come off better. So in terms of what it's setting up, it sets up a really good view of the relationship between Garibaldi and Londo, and that's already quite a well-formed relationship we see here, and Londo even apologising to Garibaldi for having had to vote against Sinclair, which he didn't really need to do that, but he clearly felt that he owed Garibaldi that, and so sort of fessed up to him. So that was an interesting dynamic. The dynamic between the Doctor and the Lieutenant Commander was interesting. Sinclair and his partner's dynamic was interesting as well. And obviously, Sinclair and Garibaldi working together to try and take down the assassin was well done. And it very bravely obviously didn't resolve certain things. Interesting positioning of G'Kar as not as the enemy per se, but clearly as someone who would not hesitate to use people and sort of maneuver them in certain ways if he felt it was going to be of advantage to his regime. And yeah, I think that the two things that we sort of were slight clangers for me were Delenn lifting Garibaldi on her shoulders and taking him out of the alien sector, and her use of this sort of power ring thing to crush G'Kar almost to death. Those things don't really chime with what we see later in the series. I think those things were somewhat out of character, and maybe the aim was to try and make it obvious how far advanced the Minbari were in terms of being able to potentially manipulate gravity in that way. But I think that was probably slightly oversold for effect. So that was that clunked a bit compared to what we see later. But that's, at the end of the day, it's a pilot episode, and they were very much sort of feeding their way. I mean, I think the whole feel of this is slightly different because obviously some of the standing sets were clearly changed between this pilot and the series, which you'd expect. But I think as a whole, I do remember watching this, and I remember it thinking at the time that it was, as a sort of a standalone film, which I probably saw it as at the time. It was very coherent. the plot did make sense. There were spaceships in it, there were guns, there were in it, and there was a sort of a mystery element to it. It has a lot of different types of drama going on in it, whilst it's also trying to sort of set the scene of what the station is and why it's there. And it was already selling itself as quite sort of hard science fiction even then, because the idea of the station being an O'Neill cylinder style station was an established science fiction concept, but it is also quite a hard science fiction concept. And there was references to lots of the station's internal area being given over to hydroponics, for example, which is exactly the sort of thing you would need to be able to have a self-sustaining environment that could actually support significant numbers of people without having to have ridiculous amounts of cargo coming in all the time. So that was the Gathering, and for a pilot episode, I think it set the whole thing up pretty well. I think inevitably some of the makeup it doesn't quite work. Some of the acting is a bit clunky. There's an element of it perhaps trying a little bit too hard, inevitably. But overall, I think the Garibaldi and Londo interactions, watching it now as I'm a bit older, I appreciate more, because I think they're far more genuine and I think they come across really well, and that works. And it's that sort of thing that it needs to work, because if all of the characters were too wooden and didn't interact well with each other, you just kind of wonder, well, why are they bothering, and I dare say that's been the downfall of many a series. But I think there are enough elements in there to keep the studio execs and indeed potential audiences interested, that obviously ultimately they were able to get it off the ground and get into season 1 to expand on a lot of these things that were set up here. I think, to my mind, the only thing that is sort of questionable about it really is the sort of the Kosh poisoning line, because given what we subsequently find out, I'm really not clear on how that was supposed to happen. But I'll not say too much more about that, because you won't be at the same point necessarily as I am. But you'll see when you find out why I'd be sort of saying okay about that as a concept. I won't go into any more detail than that. So I've done this with sort of 0 notes, so I apologise if I've rambled slightly, but I thought I would just try it like this, because otherwise I'd have to have been sort of typing incessantly all the way through the 90 minutes of it, which might have been a bit tricky to do and still get it out in a reasonable amount of time. I've been wanting to do this video for a while, because I haven't watched this DVD for, I don't know, literally decades probably. So it was nice to see it again. It was nice to see them all looking so much younger, and it was nice to see where it all sort of started as well, because it is, you can't really ignore the Gathering. The Gathering is very relevant because it sets up, even there, although some of it is more nuanced, I think, going into the seasons proper, but it does fundamentally set up the characters. I mean, Jakar's makeup I thought was more different, but actually I think Jakar's makeup probably made it through more or less unchanged from here to the series. So the really sort of critical characters kind of carried on, and it's just some of the others that you have to sort of pretend you haven't seen before, or that you haven't sort of encountered before, because obviously Lieutenant Commander changes, the Doctor changes, the Telepath changes. There are quite a few fairly major characters who do change, but as you'll see, some of that is explained, some of it isn't. Some of them you might see again, some of them you may not. So it's none of it is what I would call wrong. And I think, had it not all been pre-planned, I'm not really sure where they would have gone with the pilot in that sense. I think this is the fundamental principle behind Babylon 5, that it is plans, that so you do know where it's been and where it's going, and so it works. And this is just setting that first piece of the puzzle in place. Now, there is, of course, a film called In the Beginning, which is actually set before the Gathering and somewhat after the Gathering as well. It's complicated, but that one had the advantage of the series having run already. So of course that one was easier for them to make coherent with the series as it had happened up to that point. So I will go back to the beginning further down the line in terms of my sort of episodic reviews, because it'll make more sense to you if I look at that one later, when it's reached the point where it naturally fits in. Because if I try to do that now, it would be spoiling things left, right, and centre. So I just can't really do it. I can't really do it now for my own benefit. I need to keep doing my rewatch to actually get up to that point naturally before I try and do that sort of video. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I haven't quite figured out how to do the tech to actually kind of link it in and show you the video at the same time, as I know a lot of people do on reaction videos. I'm a little bit archaic like this, so I'm still doing my slideshow bit. And primarily just using my voice for these things, but I think for the number of people actually listening to these, there's not much point in me trying to do anything more clever with it. But if you do have an interest in that, then obviously do leave me a comment, and I can think about trying to do that for the In the Beginning film down the line, and I'll see how I get on with the episodes in the meantime. So if you're still here, thanks very much for listening. Do subscribe and like and all that good stuff to let me know that somebody is paying attention out there. And I will, in the meantime, continue on with season 2 episodes, which is where I'm at the moment. So thanks for listening and stay safe.